It's wonderful to have Dr. Cleveland here with us this evening. Will you please join me in welcoming her?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming and for being here. I'd like to open with a quick word of prayer and then just dive right in. Holy Spirit, you are welcome. We receive you, and we ask you to afflict us with your wisdom and comfort us with your wisdom as well. In Jesus' name, amen. This past spring, I celebrated my 20th reunion from high school. I can't believe I'm already one of those old alums who's coming back to campus. And so I went to my reunion in the spring and was reminded of an experience that I had when I was in high school. Now, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, Fremont, for anyone who knows that area. But when I was 15, I went to boarding school in New Hampshire, and actually this later on today, I'll tell you a little bit more about my story. But I went to this school in New Hampshire called Phillips Exeter Academy, and it's a boarding school, and most of the students were really, really, really wealthy, and were really, and they were predominantly white. And I was kind of this like black middle-class kid coming from California. And I remember interacting with a bunch of students who it just didn't seem like they had known any black people before they met me. And I became friends with this guy named John. And he and I somehow became, we must have had a class together or something, because somehow we got connected. And he made a comment one day that made it really clear to me that he didn't know any black people. And I said to him, John, I'm pretty sure I'm your first black friend. And he's from Long Island, a very wealthy family. And he looked at me and he said, that's not true. My maid is black. And I was kind of like, oh, I would love to know if she thinks you're friends. That's really interesting to me. And so, we had this relationship and we were getting to know each other. And then one day, I was in my dorm playing ping pong with my friend Kai. And Kai's black. I was friends with all the black people at the school, out of necessity, mostly. And Kai and I were playing, and then John walked in. He was looking for someone else in my dorm. And I said, oh, I'll introduce John and Kai. This will be great. Kai can meet my friend John, who I've mentioned a couple times. John can meet Kai. I can double John's black friends right here in this moment. It'll be great. And so I introduced them, and I'm like, John, meet Kai. Kai, meet John. And John says, oh, hey, Kai, I know you. You're in my math class. And Kai said, actually, I'm not. It's nice to meet you now, but we're not in the same math class. Now, at this school, all the classes have 10 students, so you really should know who's in your math class. And John insisted, no, you're in my math class. She said, no, I'm not. I know what math class I'm in. I'm not in yours. He said, yes, you are. And she said, no, I'm not. And he said, well, some black girl who looks just like you is in my math class. Awkward. And it's funny even looking in this space, because all the people of color are like, mm-hmm. And all the white people are like, what do I do? Do I laugh? Is it okay to laugh? I don't know. Tell me what to do. Yes, it's okay to laugh. It's kind of funny. But it's like, we did a little bit of investigation, and it turns out that our friend Addie, who's black, but looks nothing like Kai, was in John's math class. And he had confused the two of them. They all look the same. They all look the same. That is a mistake that we often make. It turns out that white people are not the only people who make that mistake. Whenever we make a distinction between us and them, we automatically perceive them as all the same. There's a blog called Stuff White People Like. Has anybody heard of it? It's one of my favorite things ever. Basically, this white guy is tongue-in-cheekily writing to people of color. And he says, hey, if you're a person of color and you want to get in good with white people, all you need to do is mention these things. And then these are all the things that all white people like. And so he's relying on me making the same mistake that my friend John did, They are all the same. And I fall for it every time, right? So I read his blog, and the things on the blog are like religions their parents don't belong to, assists in basketball. You know how white people love assists. Farmers markets, Halloween, ugly Christmas sweaters, right? So he has this whole list of things that white people like. And one of the things on his list, and he kind of explains why, is outdoor performance clothes. You know how white people are always wearing a North Face jacket even if they're not climbing a mountain, you know? That's what he's talking about. So this is what he says. He explains it. The main reason why white people like these clothes is that it allows them to believe that at any moment they could find themselves with a Thule rack on top of their car headed to a national park. It could be 4 p.m. on a Saturday when they might get a call. Hey man, you know what we need to do? Kayak, then camping, right now. I'm on my way to get you. There's no time to change clothes. Though it is unlikely that white people will receive this call, white people hate the idea of missing an opportunity to enjoy outdoor activities because they weren't wearing the right clothes. If you plan on spending part of your weekend with a white person, it is strongly recommended that you purchase a jacket or some sort of high-performance t-shirt, which is like a regular shirt, but just a lot more expensive. So, he's hoping that I fall into the same trap of us, them, right? He's writing to me, a black person, and he's hoping that I'm like, us is black people, them is white people, therefore, all white people are exactly the same. Now, if you are a white person, you probably will see his list and be like, hey, not all white people are like that. Of course, touche, right? Of course, not all white people are like that. But as a black person, I read that list and I'm like, this Emily's like that, Justin's like that. Yep, all white people are like that, you know? Yep. And so it's a powerful, powerful way in which we perceive, and we don't mean to do it. Today we will talk about some more sinister, both consequences of doing this and also sinister reasons for doing this. But a lot of how we perceive each other is just the way it is. And that's what we're going to talk a lot about this first part this evening. And I want to start by sharing about a study that's going to kind of help frame our discussion tonight. It turns out that social psychology's biggest gift, greatest gift to the world of psychology and to the broader academic world is that we often are unaware of the multiple influences on our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. We often think things and say things and feel things and act in ways, and we can't even explain why we did it that way. We aren't consciously aware of it. And it turns out that we can respond to the environment even if we don't know that we're responding to the environment. So Freud was a little cuckoo, as we know, but one of the things that he taught us, and that was way before his time, was that the mind is an iceberg, right? The tip of the iceberg is our conscious awareness, but the vast majority of what's happening is below conscious awareness. We have no idea why we're afraid. We have no idea why we react in repulsion to some people. We have no idea that we're even doing that. And in the 70s and 80s, social psychologists studied a lot of, can we get people to think a certain way without knowing that they're thinking a certain way? Can we get people to feel a certain way without knowing that they're feeling a certain way? And around in the 90s, we started studying, can we get people to act in a certain way without even knowing that they're being influenced to act this way? And so this is a really classic study that John Barge did when he was at NYU. And he wanted to know, can I influence people's behavior without them even knowing? So we got a bunch of college students. They're all NYU students. The average age is like 19 years old. He invited them into his lab, and he said, I'm going to give you a bunch of words, and I want you to take these words and form complete sentences with them. And that was the study. Now, what he did is half the words had to do with an elderly stereotype. He never used the word old or elderly, but he used words that you would associate with being elderly, like wrinkle and Florida and bingo. And so students had to make sentences out of those words. And so what he's doing is he's activating an elderly stereotype in their brains without them even knowing it. And then the other half of the students who participated in this study just got neutral words that don't have anything to do with age, like apple or something like that. And then he said the study's over, which is basically code for the study is totally not over and we're still monitoring you, right? And so what he did, he said, you're free to leave. And he had a research assistant at the end of the hallway where the elevator was. And they timed how long it took participants to walk from the lab to the elevator. And they found that participants who had been exposed to the elderly stereotype walked significantly more slowly than participants who hadn't been exposed to the elderly stereotype. And that just blew the field wide open. Because these were college students. These were 19-year-olds. They were not elderly. But somehow, without even knowing it, they processed the elderly stereotype as self-relevant, and it affected their behavior. So when we talk about our behaviors, when we talk about our emotions, when we talk about our thoughts and our perceptions of people, it's important to keep this in mind. We're going to be uncovering some of these processes, but these are things that happen mostly outside of our awareness. So we're going to kind of take a peek below the iceberg to see what's really going on and how is this contributing to disunity in our church, in our communities. What are some things that maybe need to come clean in my life that I haven't been thinking about so far? Another thing that I want to talk about that's going to sort of frame our conversation is this passage from Philippians 2. I love to have kind of a social psychological framing and also a theological framing. And this passage I've been studying for actually years now because I actually just finished my second book, and a big piece of the book centers on this passage. So I have looked at it from so many angles. It's like I'm dreaming it, I'm eating it, it's like I'm singing it. This passage has just been a huge part of my life. And I'm just going to go ahead and read it. This is Paul the Apostle writing to the Philippian church, a church that was about as diverse as the church in the United States. There was gender diversity in the leadership, racial diversity in the leadership. Back then, race had more to do with whether you were a slave or free than your skin color, but there was racial diversity and there was class diversity too. And so he says this to them: is there any encouragement from belonging to Christ? Any comfort from God's love? Any fellowship together in the Spirit? Are your hearts tender and compassionate? Then make me truly happy by agreeing wholeheartedly with each other, loving one another, and working together with one mind and purpose. Don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Don't look out only for your own interests, but take an interest in others too. I love Paul because he is like one of those people who just sets the bar really high all the time. Paul's not playing at all. And he is inviting us into something that's so much more intense than I thought. I grew up in the church, and when I grew up in the church and people talked about the Trinity, I kind of just felt like they were like Facebook friends, or like they were like buddies, or maybe they were roommates, and there were these three persons who hung out together and maybe sometimes collaborated. I don't really know. I don't get it. But here, Paul is drawing our attention to the Trinity in a very subtle way, because even in this first verse, he says, is there any encouragement from belonging to Christ? There he names Christ. Any comfort from God's love? There he names God. Any fellowship together in the Spirit? There he names the Holy Spirit. He's drawing our attention to the relationship of the Trinity when he says, if you get this love between these members of the Trinity, this unity between these members of the Trinity, this collaboration between the members of the Trinity, if you understand that, then that's going to lead you to interact with other people in the same way. And early church mothers and fathers understood the Trinity, and they used a term that's called perichoresis, a Greek term that describes the relationship of the Trinity, perichoresis. It's a mutual indwelling. It's an interdependence that leads to overlap and participating in the other's identity, so much so that God the Father ceases to exist as we understand him outside of relationship with the Son. The Son indwells the Father. The Spirit indwells the Son. They self-actualize only in relationship with each other. They don't exist outside of relationship with each other. They inform each other's perspectives. But what's fascinating is they're all distinct. They're different. It's their difference that they share with each other that makes them real. The Father has a perspective that's different than the Son's, and it's different than the Spirit's. There's diversity in that unity, and they're sharing of each other's perspectives in ways, and they're being informed by each other's perspectives, so much so that they cease to exist outside of relationship with each other. It's a mutual indwelling. And at the heart of that has to be equality. Because if the Father indwells the Son, but the Son doesn't get to indwell the Father, what is that? It's colonialism. One person can't just influence another without reciprocity, without the other person without receiving from the other person too. And so Paul is saying, we're talking about some hardcore unity. I'm influenced by you, you're influenced by me, I'm transformed by you. I don't get to just go into your neighborhood and tell you about who my Jesus is. I actually have to hear who your Jesus is and be transformed. So much so that I cease to exist as a human being without being in relationship with you. We are at our most human when we're practicing in the perichoresis of the Trinity, when we're participating in that, when we're living that out. And Paul's telling us this is what we get to be a part of. We're created in the image of this God. We get to be a part of this. And he says, if you get this love, then you will agree wholeheartedly with each other. You will be one. You will love one another, working together with one mind and purpose. And he's not saying, I want you all to agree. I want you all to vote for the same person. I want you all to shop at the same stores. I want you all to read the same translation of the Bible. He's not saying that. He's saying sharing brain space, being influenced by each other, being transformed by each other, developing equal and mutual relationships, addressing inequality, addressing division. How can we practice this oneness of the Trinity? The Trinity is not all three of the same people. There's not three fathers. There's not three spirits. Nobody wants uniformity. And so Paul gives us a little hint that we're going to come to in a few moments. But first he says, work towards this unity, and then he gives us a hint that it's your self-esteem, it's your selfishness that might get in the way. So we're going to get to that in a few moments. But first I want to talk about how hard it is to just do this first part. Agreeing wholeheartedly, being one. Now, as I talked about earlier, when I first started, we make these us-them distinctions, right? My friend John did the same. It was an us, all white people, you, black people, black girls. All black girls in my math class look the same. And I do the same thing when I read that blog. And I read about white people, and I say, yes, they are all like that. Now, as soon as we make these us-them distinctions, we start to categorize. And this is actually, in general, not a bad thing. Not a bad thing at all. We categorize everything. I had never seen this podium before I came here this morning. Never. Brand new, novel object to me. However, when I walked into the room and saw it, I didn't have to come up to the podium. I didn't have to smell it. I didn't have to investigate it. I didn't have to interview it. I didn't have to wonder, what does this thing do for me? Should I run from it? Should I stand on it? Should I eat it? Is it going to spontaneously self-combust? What is this thing? Because even though I've never seen this particular podium before, I have a category for podiums. And so I thought, this seems similar to my category for podiums. I'm just going to go ahead and assume that that's a podium and that it's not going to attack me. . Was it a safe assumption? So far, so good, right? We do this for everything, and it saves tons of energy. It's great. We're cognitive misers. We're constantly looking to conserve energy, and you know what? It's actually a good thing. Our brains are designed to do that because we are just bombarded with information, sights, smells, sounds all the time, and our brains naturally filter it out and decide what to pay attention to and what to just categorize and make assumptions about. If you've ever traveled internationally, or you're an international student and you're like, this is my life all the time here in the United States, then you know this. I went to China not too long ago because my parents invited me to go, and I was supposed to meet them there in Shanghai, but my parents, they're bananas. They march to their own beat. And so they called me and they were like, oh, sorry, yeah, I know we're supposed to be in Shanghai with you, but we're still in Bogota for a few more days. So can we just meet you there in a little while? And I'm like, sure. This is like the story of my life. So I'm just hanging out in Shanghai by myself. I don't know the language. I don't know how to get around. I don't know the customs, but I'm like, this is cool. I'll just go out and about. But whenever you travel somewhere and you don't know what's going on, you have to think about everything. So I go into a restaurant and I'm like, is this a host? Do I talk to that person? Is that a waiter? Are they going to bring me water? Am I supposed to tip? What are the customs? You're overthinking everything. And I remember at the end of that first day, I'd had a great day, but I was exhausted, a different type of exhausted than when I'm in the States. Because when I go into the States, I walk into a restaurant and I can make all these assumptions about what's going to happen. I don't even think about it, right? So sometimes categories are amazing. They save so many resources. But the downside is, in order to categorize, we have to make these us-them distinctions. We got to group. And we got to group people, not just podiums. And it's easier for me when I can look at somebody and say, oh, yeah, I mean, that's a SoCal person. That's totally different than a NorCal person. And then I don't have to really get to know them or think about it. Or that's a Calvinist, and that's a Wesleyan. And I can just make some assumptions, lots of assumptions. Or that's a Republican, and that's a Democrat. That's a Trump supporter, that's a Hillary supporter. And I don't have to think about it. And maybe a lot of my categories are accurate most of the time. But like any shortcut, categories sometimes miss out on important information, right? So one of the things is we make these us-them distinctions, and sometimes they're not always helpful. Another thing is what I talked about earlier. As soon as we make these us-them distinctions, our brain automatically perceives them as all the same. What I talked about earlier with stuff white people like and with my friend John is called outgroup homogeneity. They are all the same. Meanwhile, we are all unique and varied, and how dare you think that we're all the same? Who's the Fresno Pacific rival? Do you all have one, students? Who? APU, they're the worst. So here's the thing that's interesting. When I taught at Bethel, there was a school down the street called Northwestern. And Bethel students had all these ideas about Northwestern students, and Northwestern students had all these ideas about Bethel students. Now, if you went to the University of Minnesota, you just thought Bethel students and Northwestern students were all the same crazy Christians. You know, it's like that distinction didn't even matter, right? So oftentimes these us-them distinctions only make sense in our context. But as soon as we make those us-them distinctions, we say they are all the same. They are all the same. And even though I gave you an example that's kind of funny about my friend John and my friend Kai, and I use the example of stuff white people like, oftentimes they are all the same can carry with it a weight. And people get trapped in that sameness. Because sometimes they are all the same can be really negative. And when I was in, it's interesting to think about this in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, because a lot of my students at Duke Divinity School are millennials. And they think that the issue of police brutality against black and brown people is like a new thing, because they didn't know that this has been going on forever and ever. And so I was talking with them about something that happened when I was just graduating from high school. I don't know if you remember in the February of 1999 when a black African immigrant named Amadou Diallo was shot and killed by 4 white NYPD officers. And he was coming home from work late at night on a Saturday night, kind of 2 o'clock in the morning. He worked as a short order cook in a restaurant. And this was in the context of Rudy Giuliani being the mayor of New York City. Now, if you've been to Times Square anytime in the past few years, it kind of looks like Disneyland, like it's just very touristy. But when I was a kid, New York was really different than it is now. And Rudy Giuliani has been credited with sort of cleaning up the streets, but that has also come with allegations of racial profiling and police brutality. So they kind of cleaned up the streets in ways that made a lot of black and brown people feel afraid of the police. And so Amadou Diallo is coming home from work late at night, and 4 white NYPD officers yell out to him from a few blocks away, "Stop, we'd like to talk with you." Now he's presumably thinking, white police haven't been super safe around here lately, so he starts running in the other direction to run to his house. They chase him a couple blocks to his house. He runs up the stairs to his apartment. The porch light is on, so he's backlit, and so he just looks like a silhouette. And they say, "Stop." And he pulls out his wallet to show his identification that he's not the person that they're presumably looking for. They think it's a gun, and they shot him. And then they shot him again, and they shot him again, and they shot him again, and they shot him 41 times. And upon examination, it turns out he really was pulling out his wallet. He did not have a gun. So there were 4 white armed police officers, 1 unarmed black man, and he was killed. And there was national and international outcry. I was actually in Spain doing YWAM when this happened. I did that gap year in between high school and college and I heard about it over there, and there were protests in Spain about this brutality, this injustice. And what's interesting about this is that the white NYPD officers did polygraph tests and other lie detection tests, and they really swear that they thought it was a gun. They seem to believe that they thought it was a gun. And so a social psychologist named Keith Payne, who's actually one of my colleagues at University of North Carolina, just across town from Duke, did a study. He was like, what is it about how we perceive black men in America, that they are all the sameness of black men in America, that would lead 4 white NYPD officers in the heat of the moment with little information to assume that he had a gun instead of a wallet, to assume that he was dangerous instead of safe? Can we study this? Can we investigate this? Can we start to understand what's happening? And so what he did is he created a brilliant study, and a study that's become a classic in its own right. And what he did is he showed a subliminal picture of either a black man or a white man to participants. Now, subliminal means that you're presented with a picture, but it's presented so quickly on the computer screen that you actually can't say that you saw it. You didn't consciously see it. So if you present, it's like less than 300 milliseconds, people won't be able to say they saw anything. It's just flashed too quickly. However, as we know, we can non-consciously be influenced. So people are exposed to a racial picture of either a black or a white man, but they don't know they've been exposed to a black or white man. And then he paired each of those pictures with a picture of either a tool or a gun. And that picture was not presented subliminally. The picture of the tool or the gun was not presented subliminally. It was flashed really quickly, so they knew they saw something, and participants had to make a guess. Did you see a gun or a tool? Just be as accurate as possible. Was it a gun? Was it a tool? You kind of have to make a split-second guess. And he's trying to recreate this situation that the NYPD police officers were in. It was clearly a racialized situation. They were white. Amadou Diallo was black. But it wasn't an explicitly racialized situation, right? It wasn't like they got into a fight about a racial issue. And then these police officers had to make a quick judgment with fuzzy information. And so this is what he's trying to create for these students. So these are examples: black man and a gun. Remember, the picture of the black man was presented subliminally, but I contacted Dr. Payne to get the actual pictures so that I could show. So black man and a gun, black man and a tool, white man and a gun, white man and a tool. And he presented hundreds of these combinations to participants, and they just had on their computer, gun, tool, gun, tool, gun, tool. And then he wanted to see, are participants accurate? And what's interesting is this was participants of all races. It was a really diverse sample, not just white participants, but all sorts of college students. And he found that when participants were exposed to a white face before seeing a gun, they misidentified the gun as a tool. But when they were exposed to a black face before seeing a tool, they misidentified the tool as a gun. This study's been replicated over and over and over again with all sorts of samples, all sorts of people, community samples, university samples. In the United States, we automatically assume that black men are dangerous and white men are safe or industrious. And I was reading a bunch of Payne's research a few years ago when my brother was a divinity student at Yale Divinity School. And I called him up with this study, and I'm like, hey, I'd love to share this study with you. And I shared it with him, and we were FaceTiming. And my brother, who I hardly ever see cry, I just saw one tear go down his face. And he just said, why would anybody ever even bother doing that study? Why would anybody even fund that study? What a waste of time. Everybody who's a black man knows that we are hunted in our society, that people see us as dangerous before they see us as human. He says, I walk home from the divinity school at Yale all the time, and the white female students walk to the other side of the street because they don't feel safe. He said, and at this point, he hadn't even shared this with me, even though he shares a lot with me. He said, in the last year alone, 3 times while walking home from the divinity school, and his apartment was only 1.5 blocks away from the divinity school, 3 times in the last year, I've been stopped and frisked by the New Haven police because I supposedly look like somebody that they're looking for. Why would anyone even bother doing that research? So much pain in his eyes. And then I think about what Paul tells us in Philippians, to be of one mind. We can't be of one mind if we can't hear these experiences and be moved to action. That's what it means to share brain space. That's what it means to practice perichoresis, is to say your experience gets to inform my perspective on the world. I don't get to just say, that's not my story, therefore it can't be true. I've never been stopped and frisked by the police, so if he was stopped and frisked, it probably means that, he did something to deserve it, because I've never had that happen to me. To practice perichoresis is to say, tell me more. How do I understand more of what it's like to be you? How do I get to see how disunity affects you? The really neat thing about Keith Payne's research, and in particular this study, is that he's found that my mic is falling off. Let me see if I can fix this real quick. He's found that participants who were aware that they had this bias and then were motivated to override it were actually able to do so. If participants knew, you know what, I bet I automatically think that black men are dangerous, so I'm going to take an extra split second to make sure that I'm choosing correctly. They were a little bit slower than other participants, but they were more accurate. So it's possible with motivation and with spaciousness, stopping, cognitive ability, right? Not being cognitive misers, but being cognitively generous. Then we can begin to override these. But it starts by even knowing that we're doing this. Another thing that, so let me just recap. Because of the way that our brains work, we've already made these us-them distinctions between people who are like us or not like us, race, gender, class, sexuality, all sorts of things, theology. And then we've already decided that they are all the same. Not really much to them. I mean, they're all the same. You've seen one, you've seen them all. And then the next thing that happens is we tend to have really inaccurate meta-perceptions. We automatically assume that they don't like us or want to know us. A meta-perception is what we think they think of us. And when it comes to divisions and wanting to cross the bridge, what we think they think of us is actually more important than what they actually think of us. Because that's what's going to stop us from taking a step towards unity. And meta-perceptions are overwhelmingly inaccurate. They tend to be pessimistic. That's just the consequence of these categorizations. It's us and it's them, and they don't want to know us. I get to travel all over the place and just sort of keep tabs on what's happening in the church. I kind of like to be in the know. And so I heard about an event in Minneapolis. And I was living there at the time, but it was at a church that I wasn't really attending. So I just heard about it, and I don't recommend this under any circumstances. But in response to some of the racial divisions in the city, this church decided to host a unity event, a unity night, to bring everybody together. Don't recommend it. Bad idea. We can talk about why it's such a bad idea in the Q&R if you want, but not a good idea. But anyways, if you're going to do it, which I, again, don't recommend, but if you're going to do it, they did it textbook, right? They did it as well as you could possibly do it. So this was a white church. They wanted to bring white churches and black churches together for a one-time unity event to bring everyone, kumbaya. So the white church pastor preached a sermon series on reconciliation. Good, trying to get his congregation just ready theologically for this event. They also decided to make the planning team diverse. So half the people on the planning team were from white churches, half the people on the planning team were from black churches. They sold half the tickets to white churches, half the tickets to black churches. The tickets were billed as like racial unity event. Come and connect with people who are different than you. They brought in a gospel choir. They had a soul food dinner. They even had tables that were bar height without chairs so that people couldn't just sit down. They kind of had to mingle and interact with each other. So, if you're going to do something like this, which again, I don't recommend, they did it about as good as you could possibly do it. So, of course, I bought a ticket, because far be it from me to turn and look the other way when I see a train wreck about to happen, right? So, I was there, and I walk in, I'm a few minutes late, and everyone's there, basically. It's sold out event. And I walk in, and all the black people are on this side of the room, and all the white people are on this side of the room. It was like two different events. They looked like they were dressed for two different events. The white people were like in flip-flops and like a North Face t-shirt, okay? And the black people were in like three-piece suits and hats, right? It was like black people dressed to the nines. White people looked like they just got back from the beach, right? So even just like, I'm like, did you all even sign up for the same event, right? But then the black people had their food, talking to each other, white people had their food. So I went over to the white side and I'm like, hey, white people, why are you not talking to the black people? And they were like, well, I don't think they really want to talk to us. So then I went over to the black side and I'm like, hey, black people, why are you not talking to the white people? And they're like, well, they're over there because they don't really want to talk to us. And I was like, everyone came here to make a friend from another race. Like, at the end of the day, this is like a transaction. You bought your ticket, go get your friend. This is not that complicated. Like, what is going on here? And that is what's so powerful about these meta-perceptions, Even when people have a little bit of preaching to support unity, even when people have some organizational, support for unity, even when people have the motivation for unity, they showed up at this event, they still could not cross the divide because they had this non-conscious idea that they don't really like us or want to know us. Research on inaccurate metaperception show that they are overwhelmingly pessimistic and almost always inaccurate. When it comes down to it, the vast majority of whoever they are actually would be happy to get to know you if you approach them in a humanizing way. If you see their humanity, people have no problem being friends with you. But we see this all the time. There's a book called Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria? And oftentimes when I'm talking at Christian colleges, a white student will ask that, well, why do all the black kids sit together in the cafeteria? I think it's because they don't want to know us. And I'm like, well, why do all the white kids sit together in the cafeteria? How come no one asked that question either? And usually it's because they're like, well, I don't think they really want to know us. And that's what stops us. So we already have an us-them distinction. We've already decided that they are all the same. We've also decided that they don't like us. So at this point, why would we even try, right? But we got to keep going. There's more. These are all non-conscious processes. What happens, too, when we make these us-them distinctions is now we want to make sure we can maintain those distinctions. If you think about it, these us-them distinctions are our way of categorizing. They're our way of making sense of the world. They're our way of simplifying things. So we want to exaggerate the difference between us and them so that makes it really clear who's who. It's not helpful for me to have fuzzy categories. It's not helpful for me to not be able to tell really quickly whether you're a Calvinist or an Arminian, or whether you're an APU person or a Fresno Pacific person, or whether you're documented or undocumented as an immigrant. I don't want to have to waste all my cognitive energy having a conversation with you. So I'd rather just have very clear boundaries. And I'm going to exaggerate the differences between us and them in order to make it really obvious who is us and who is them. And research shows that we have a special hatred. Our hatred for the people who blur the lines is greater than our hatred for them. Research on the black sheep effect shows this. My friend Dan Frings and I, who's a professor at South Bank University in London, have done some studies together where we've looked at black sheep. Now, who are black sheep? Black sheep are the people who technically are part of our group, but on at least one major issue, they don't toe the party line. So a black sheep would be, for example, a pro-choice Republican, or like someone who's registered as a Democrat who voted for Trump. Right? Because you're like, wait a second, you're blurring the lines. If you're a Democrat who voted for Trump, who are Democrats? What is a Democrat? I can't work with that. And so we hate black sheep. We hate how quickly do Christians call other Christians heretics? When really, most heretics are just people who blur the lines. Right? If you interpret Scripture that way, and I interpret Scripture this way, now you're making me question what it means to be Christian. I can't have that. That is complicating my categories. Therefore, you're a black sheep, and I feel like it's okay to hate you and punish you. And the study that Dan and I did together, we gave participants an opportunity to interact with a black sheep. So we brought in, we were at UC Santa Barbara when we did this study, and so we brought in students who either identified strongly as Republicans or Democrats, and then we had them interact with someone in our lab. They're called Confederates. They're research assistants who work for us, but they pose as participants, and so they had to interact with a Confederate who was a black sheep. And so if they were Republican, they had to interact with a black sheep Republican. If the participant was a Republican, they had to interact with a black sheep Republican. And if the participant was a Democrat, they had to interact with a black sheep Democrat. And the participant's job was to teach this wayward black sheep and get them to come back into the fold, okay? So they had to give a persuasive speech. And then afterwards, we always set it up so that the black sheep didn't learn. They didn't learn. They're still black sheep. You didn't persuade them. Therefore, you have a choice. You can punish them because that's your right. If you'd like to. Now, if you want, you can just walk away. The study's over. But if you'd like to punish them, you can. Here are the options. We can put their hand in an ice bucket for 15 minutes. We can torture them. We can shock them. Or we can put a noise blast in their ear. Which one would you like to choose? We weren't actually doing any of these things. Don't worry. We weren't torturing people. But they believed this person was in the other room yelling and screaming, and so they believed that we were torturing them. Don't worry. We debriefed everyone afterwards. You guys look worried. I'm a PK, a pastor's kid, and so the best thing about being a social psychologist is sort of my inner my inner deceptive person comes out, and I'm like, oh, cool, deception's like legal now. This is awesome, right? So, anyways, don't worry, we debrief everybody, and we go through ethics boards. They weren't actually being tortured, but we want to see how far will people go. What does this reveal about humanity? And when we gave participants these options after they were frustrated with this black sheep, our participants were like, can we do all of the torture options? Like, can we just, do I have to pick one? They were so uncomfortable with this black sheep. They wanted that person to just go away. It is not okay to blur the lines. That's how powerful our categories are. And so we often go out of our way to maintain those boundaries, and exaggerating our differences is one of the ways that we do that. And it's not to say that there aren't really important differences. Like I said, the members of the Trinity were different. And it's only in their difference that they were able to be whole. So I don't want to minimize differences. I don't believe in color blindness. I don't think that we are all the same. But on the flip side, because of the way that we categorize, we often exaggerate the differences. We often make too big a deal out of them. We often allow them to be the reason why we can't come together in really healthy ways. And I saw this so powerfully when I was 30 years old. I left Santa Barbara and I decided to move to Minneapolis, and I joined the faculty there. And I learned something about Minnesotans. Any Minnesotans here in the room? Oh, good. I probably won't offend anyone. This is great. Okay, so Minnesotans are really interesting because I'm a California girl, and I know here in California, for the most part, we only talk about the weather when there's really nothing else to talk about. It's not an actual legitimate conversation topic, right? It's just oh yeah, no, okay, we'll talk about the weather. In Minnesota, there can be 3 major national events, like a presidential election going on, a super intense international event, and Minnesotans are still their priority is to talk about the weather. It's the number one topic. It comes up all the time. And so when I first moved there, I moved there in July, and every conversation went just like this. Oh, where'd you just move from? Because Minnesotans are also friendly. They're like, oh, where'd you just move from? I just moved here from Santa Barbara. Oh my gosh, you just moved here from Santa Barbara? Yes. Have you ever experienced the Minnesota weather? No, it's July, and I just moved here. Oh my gosh, you're going to die. That's how every single conversation went. You're going to die. And so, I'm there for a couple weeks, and I'm just having this conversation, and they go on and on and on about how horrible the winters are and how I'll never survive it, and it's why did I even come? Now, I'm at Trader Joe's one day, and you know how at Trader Joe's they have to talk to you and kind of be your friend while you're there, the people who work there? So I'm there, and the person who's checking me out is starting a conversation, pretending he wants to get to know me and everything, and we're chatting, and he's like, so tell me your story. And I'm like, okay, while you're I'll tell you my story. I just moved here, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, oh my gosh, you just moved here from Santa Barbara? Same thing. I'm like, yes. And he's like, oh, have you experienced Minnesota winter? You're gonna die. And now at this point, I'm kind of getting a little salty, I'm kind of you know what, I've had it with these people. So I pushed back just a little bit with Mr. Trader Joe's guy. And I'm like, well, I did go to boarding school and college in New Hampshire. Pretty tough winters there. And he's like, it's way worse here. And I'm like, oh, really? When did you live in New Hampshire so you could compare and contrast the winters? And he's like, I've never been to New Hampshire. In fact, I don't even know where New Hampshire is. I'm just telling you it's worse here. And I'm like, well, especially when I was in college, I went to school on the Appalachian Trail in the White Mountains, and we had some pretty tough blizzards. I feel like I can survive a Minnesota. There's no way you can survive a Minnesota winter. It's just so much more hardcore here. Meanwhile, 3 Minnesotans are in the line behind me, right? And they have skin in the game because they're Minnesotans. So they're getting involved and they're like, oh, but it's an arid cold compared to a wet cold. And that's the difference. Another person, this older woman is like, but you weren't here for the Halloween blizzard of 91, and she's just like totally getting into it. And I'm just like pushing back and I'm like, yeah, but it almost snowed at graduation one year. And, we're going back and forth. And then finally, I'm like, does someone have to win this conversation? Because at the end of the day, we've all experienced really rough winters. Like, we should just do a group hug right here in Trader Joe's. I've been through some hard winters. You've been through some hard winters. You've had parties canceled. I've had parties canceled. I've been snowed in. You've been snowed in. We have a lot more in common than we have difference. And it got me thinking as I was driving home, I'm like, man, if my identity as a, New Hampshire person was in such contrast with their identity as Minnesotans, what about my identity as like a Christian versus a Muslim? How might I exaggerate differences? My identity as a Democrat versus a Republican, my identity as a middle-class person versus someone who is upper class. How might this influence the way that I relate to people around me if this is a natural consequence of categorization? So that's the easy part. Because we don't mean to do any of this. And I don't think it's sinister. I think it's natural. I think it has sinister consequences, but I don't think we mean to do any of this. The only thing is it gets uglier, because often when we have these exaggerated differences, we are so different than them. What that often means is we are better than them. And that's where it starts to get really ugly. And Paul pointed that out to us in Philippians 2 when he said, watch out for your self-interests. Don't think of yourselves as better than other people. Look out for the interests of them. It's like Paul was a social psychologist. It's like he knew. He knew that disunity was not going to just be about we're so different, but we're better. He said, pay attention to your heart and your identity and your self-esteem and your need to feel good about yourself. And one of the things we found is that individual identity and group identity, they really occur on a continuum. Our self-concept is both as an individual and as a group member. And it goes back and forth, depending on the situation. And our group memberships significantly inform our individual identity. And that's important for us to notice. Because when it comes to our individual identity, we are incredibly defensive. Incredibly. And actually, that's not always a bad thing. And as I've learned more about the way the self works, I've actually had a lot more compassion for myself and compassion for others. Because social psychologists don't agree on what exactly self-esteem is, but we all agree that it's immensely important. And there's so many ways in which we protect our self-esteem. We have what we call self-serving biases, and these biases, without even knowing it, protect us from taking hits to our self-esteem. And self-esteem is actually really helpful, and on average, these self-serving biases, they serve us well. In the United States, on average, most people say that they have a self-esteem of about 8, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest. We like ourselves. We think we're pretty awesome. And self-esteem is a wonderful buffer for life stressors. It helps us get along better with other people. It's not a bad thing to feel good about yourself. The thing is because we are so motivated to feel good about ourselves, we often engage in the world in really biased ways that protect our self-esteem. We're very defensive when it comes to our sense of self. And one of the ways we do this is by not taking any personal responsibility for failure. And it's natural. So, if I love undergrads, and when I teach undergrads, I often give exams. And undergrads love to think of themselves as smart, and so like all human beings. And if one of my students fails an exam, whose fault is it? Who gets blamed? Me, right? I am a terrible communicator. I'm a terrible instructor. It's because I can't clearly communicate the concepts in the class that they failed. I am evil, I've been told. I stay up all night just coming up with trick questions so I can just trick them. I have been accused of ruining people's GPA. I have been accused of not being available for, 47 office hours a week. But you weren't there when I needed you. Therefore, I failed the exam, right? It's always my fault. And you know what? When my students say that to me, I don't even get mad. I'm just like, oh, good job. You're protecting your self-esteem. That's sweet. I don't even have to take it personally, because we all do it. We all do it. It's just a natural thing that we do. Now, what happens if on the next exam they ace it? Who gets the credit? No one has ever come to me and said, Dr. Cleveland, it's because of you. I just want to give all the glory and honor to you for this A. No one ever says that. No one ever says, it's because you extended your office hours to help me. It's because in the middle of the night, you answered my question. It's because you're just an amazing teacher. And these are really difficult concepts, but you explain it in a way that makes it really easy to understand. And thank you. Thank you. No, it's like, nailed it. Right? This is what we do. We take credit for our accomplishments. We deflect our failures. And I don't even take it personally. I'm just like, oh, good job. You're maintaining your self-esteem. That's going to serve you well in life. We all do this. Another thing we do is we tend to compare ourselves in ways that are favorable to our self-esteem, right? If someone says, okay, Dr. Cleveland, how smart are you on a scale of 1 to 10? I'm like, who should I compare myself to? I'm not going to choose Albert Einstein, because then I won't think of myself as very smart. So I'm going to like, compared to Kim Kardashian, I'm a genius, right? And so we get to choose. I can always seem smart. I can always seem godly. Well, yeah, compared to that megachurch down the street where pretty much all they do is just like church shop all the time and just consumeristic Christianity, I'm awesome. Or compared to those people who, don't even care about the poor. At least I have a compassionate child. It's interesting. We get to choose who we compare ourselves to. We can always look good. We can always set it up so we don't have to look at how we need to grow, how maybe we're contributing to the problem, how maybe we've failed. And so we have these built-in self-serving biases. It's just good to notice that. Again, it's human. No shame here, but it's good to just notice that, because we can't grow if we don't notice. This is maybe something that I do. Now, what's tricky is that if we're like that as individuals, and our individual identity overlaps with our group identity, we get real defensive when it comes to our group, because we want to feel good about ourselves. And in order to do that, we have to feel good about our group. I was working with a seminary that was interested in, interested in addressing racial issues. They had a pretty atrocious hate crime that happened on campus, one of those hate crimes where it shocks the whole community and everyone's like, how could this possibly have happened? Well, the white people are like, how could this have possibly happened? And all the people of color are like, oh, please, obviously this happens. But it got them to the point where they wanted to have a conversation. And these were good people. They were like, this is not okay. We need to address this. Help us. Let's come in. And so what I did is I created an entire, we did a listening process. And this is the first time in the history of this seminary, it's like 150 years old or something like that, the first time where anyone knew, it's the first time where the entire community was heard about their experiences. Usually, when they have these sorts of surveys or listening opportunities, it's mostly just the faculty and senior administrators who get to participate. And this time, we asked students, all students. We asked staff. We asked faculty. We asked alums. We asked other community members who were like constituents. And we were really careful to break people into focus groups that were safe. So like students of color got to meet, LGBTQ students got to meet together. So you didn't have to share something in a space that didn't seem safe. Junior faculty didn't have to talk about their experiences in front of senior faculty, that kind of stuff. And when I collated all the data from this listening. It was like a 2-month process, and it was beautiful. There was a lot of love for the community, but also some real critiques about the community, of course. And I presented this to the dean and all the faculty in one of the faculty meetings. And at the beginning of the faculty meeting, the dean and a bunch of the senior, most powerful faculty members were like, this is so great. I'm excited to hear what students think and what alums think and what staff people think. And I'm excited to hear what my colleagues of color think. And this is just a beautiful thing that you've done. Thank you for bringing all of this to our attention. And I'm like, ooh, about to eat those words. So then I go and I present the data, and it's unfortunate. So most of the white people, most of the men, most of the faculty more or less like it at the school and think it's a great, affirming place. And most of the people of color and the LGBTQ folks and first in their family to go to college students, under-resourced students, a lot of the staff felt like they weren't treated well, that they weren't compensated well, that their voice wasn't heard. And they're kind of, for the first time, like, hey, I got something to say. This is the first time anyone's asked me, and I got something to say. And I remember talking with some of the custodians at the Divinity School, at the seminary. 4 black women who were the custodians. They between the 4 of them, there were 46 years that they had been there. And they were like, this is the first time anyone's asked me what I think. What do I think? There's not a lot of divinity at this divinity school. That's what I think. If only people could see what we see. So when I shared this feedback, all anonymously, I didn't say this so-and-so said this, but this is what I'm hearing. This is an opportunity for them to listen, to learn, to practice perichoresis, right? To be transformed by someone else's perspective. The response was, I don't even recognize the school that they're talking about. Who are all these bitter people that you found? They just seem disgruntled. Who are these students that you interviewed? These students, they've only been here for 3 months. How could they possibly know anything? I graduated from this school. This is someone who graduated from the school like 30 years ago. I graduated from this school, and my experience was amazing. How dare they say that this isn't an awesome place? I felt supported here. Deflect, deflect, deflect. These are people who wanted to lean in. They wanted to hear. But their need to feel good about themselves, their need to protect this institution that had treated them well, that was a positive impact on their identity. Because it's like, well, wait a second. If people of color and LGBTQ persons and staff people and custodians are saying that this place is racist, what does that say about me? I can't hear that. And yet Paul says, look out not only for your own interests, but for the interests of others. It's actually harder to go to a school that has institutional racism than to hear that maybe you're a professor at a school that has institutional racism. Look out not only for your own interests, but look out for the interests of others. We're running out of time. I'm going to skip this. Read my book. I want to make sure we have some time for Q&A, and I want to move into what I wrote this summer in my book that I just finished on power. So Paul says, look out not only for your own interests, and then he gives us this really incredible, oh my gosh, just incredible poem of what that looks like. And I love my Duke Divinity students because they're so young. We have the youngest seminary students in the country. The average age is like 24. They're just little munchkins. And they're so bright-eyed, and they got so much hope. And they're going to change the Methodist Church. They are. It hasn't been changed in hundreds of years, but they're going to change it. And so it's just so cute. And they come in, and they quote this passage to me all the time. And I love it because I love this passage too. But it's really funny. So we'll read it. And they say, you must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God, and he died a criminal's death on a cross. Okay, so when I talk to my students, they're like, yeah, I'm going to go out there. I'm going to be a different kind of leader. I'm like, what does that mean? They're like, I'm going to like kenosis. Like what happens in Philippians 2, where Jesus emptied himself. I'm going to do kenosis. And I'm like, oh, cool. Like, what does that mean? I don't know. I'm just going to be humble. Okay, cool. I love that. I like humility. What does that mean? Well, I'm just going to be humble. Okay, that sounds vague. It's starting to sound vague. What exactly are you going to do? And that's the thing about this, the way that we've talked about kenosis, that we've talked about incarnation. They're like buzzwords. Kenosis is this Greek word that means to empty oneself, and that's what Paul's talking about in this passage. Jesus did not cling to his divine privileges, but he emptied himself of them and was humbled to the position of a slave. And it's inspiring, which is why we're all inspired by it, me and my students included. But what we often want to do is just practice this. We think the solution is to just do this. The problem is when people who have privilege try to be humble, oppressed people usually get hurt. Because we're not Jesus. We don't have the omniscience that Jesus has. And we often look at this passage and we don't do critical analysis on what does it look like as a human being to practice kenosis, to empty myself of my privileges like Jesus did. Part of it is we often just look at kenosis as the act of incarnation, when Jesus came to earth, giving up his divine privileges as God and becoming a human. And that's just, as a human being, it's hard for me to model my life after that because I can't cross metaphysical planes like Jesus did. So it's just kind of like, okay, like that's beautiful. Paul does a great job of describing it in a poetic way, but what does that mean for me? And so what I did with one of my colleagues who's a New Testament scholar is we sat down and we went through the entire Gospels, looking at Jesus' life as a human being on earth, and how Jesus emptied himself of his privileges as a human being in the context of other human beings. So we kind of started the kenosis analysis from when he came to earth. Because the fact of the matter is I can't cross metaphysical planes like Jesus did, but I can model my life after Jesus, the human being, who lived in a complex world like I do. How did Jesus empty himself while he was here on earth? And we created a whole new way of interpreting Scripture based on this idea. Because the fact of the matter is, Jesus lived in a society that's a lot like ours. Jesus lived in a society where there was a ton of inequality, where some people had a voice and other people didn't have a voice, where some people had access to freedom, to rights, and other people didn't. Jesus lived in a really oppressive society. They were under Roman oppression. They were under Roman occupation. And so even though we often think of Jesus as being really poor, and in some ways he was, I mean, that's obvious if you look at Scripture, when his parents when he went to be circumcised at the temple, his parents sacrificed 2 doves, which is like the poor person's version of 2 lambs. If they had had more money, they would have sacrificed 2 lambs. And of course, Jesus was born in a manger. We know that. And yeah, Jesus was a Jew under Roman occupation, which was not great. But on the flip side, Jesus had a lot of privilege in society as a human being, not just as God, but as a human being. Jesus wasn't Roman. He was Jewish, but that sure beats being a Samaritan. And Jesus is even pointing out, Jewish people have some privilege compared to Samaritans. Jesus was a man in a society in which women had very little rights. Jesus was free in a slave society. Jesus' family was important enough to be counted in the census. They didn't count all living human beings. They just counted the ones who were considered human beings, free people. Jesus' family had a small business. Jesus had some privilege. And then, maybe more than any of it, Jesus was a leader. He had a voice. Thousands of people would show up when he had something to say. That right there is power and privilege. And so I've looked through the Gospels to examine, does Jesus have a sociological imagination? Does Jesus understand where he's located socially relative to other people? Does Jesus know where he has a voice where other people don't? And is he acting on that? Is he giving up his privilege in his relationships with other people? And I've looked, it's amazing. It's astounding when you look at Scripture with this hermeneutic. How is Jesus noting the social situation, the inequality at place, and how is Jesus giving up his privilege and power in order to create space and community and wholeness and reconciliation in that community? I'm just going to give you one example of this to help you think about it. I love this story because I've been a Young Life volunteer for like 15 years, and this is a story that we often tell kids in the fall when we're talking about the person of Jesus, and we just want kids to know this is who Jesus is. And this story is so central to that, and it's the story of Jairus and the woman who'd been bleeding for 12 years. And this is like such a beautiful story to me because after developing this hermeneutic, I look at it so differently, even though I've heard it told hundreds of times as a Young Life volunteer, and I've even told it lots of times myself to kids. But this is it's an interesting story in the context of what's happening in Jesus' life and ministry, because up until this point, Jesus has only been performing miracles and primarily teaching amongst the down and out in society. And Jesus was not respected by the religious establishment. He wasn't accepted by the power structure in society. And he was mostly hanging out with lepers and blind people and folks who hang out by a pool of water hoping that the Holy Spirit will stir it up. You know, these are not people who have a lot going for them. He's hanging out with people who didn't even have enough money to bring their own lunch, and so he has to sort of create a miracle to feed everybody. And Jairus comes. Jairus is a leader. Depending on who you're talking to in the Gospels, he's either a religious leader or he's a political leader. Either way, Jairus has power. Jairus is an important person in society, unlike all these other people that Jesus has been hanging out with. And Jairus is just like all privileged and powerful people. Jairus has a need that money can't fix. Jairus has his own pain. Just because you have privilege and power doesn't mean you don't experience hard things. And so Jairus has a child who's sick. And I'm sure at this point, Jairus has already spent all the money, gotten all the surgeons, had all the specialists, had all of the herbal remedies, whatever, right? Infomercials, calling everybody, getting, Hail Marys. And his child is still sick. And so he goes against what's considered legitimate in society. And he says, hey, this Jesus guy, he's kind of the Messiah of the riffraff, but if he can help me, I'm going to humble myself and I'm going to go ask for help. I'm going to be honest about my need. So here we see Jairus descending on a large crowd of people, probably thousands of people, who he probably doesn't typically mingle with. Jairus is probably not in the mix with lepers, with homeless folks, with blind folks. He's probably smelling some things he hasn't smelled in a long time. He's probably seeing some things up close that are unsightly. He's probably hearing some cries, some whimpers, some stories maybe about what it's like to live on the edge of society, outside of the realm of what's blessed in society. So here we already have a situation where Jairus is being exposed, being invited into perichoresis in a way that he hasn't been because his need has brought him there. Has brought him into this community that he would have avoided under normal circumstances. And Jesus is just there, healing folks. And Jairus comes and says, will you please heal my child? And Jesus is like, for sure. Of course. Absolutely. I'm going to come with you right now. And as Jesus is walking towards Jairus' house, all three of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all say the same thing. This woman who'd been bleeding for 12 years touches Jesus' cloak, and all of them say, Jesus felt the power go out of him, and she was healed. It's done. Jesus knew she was healed. She knew she was healed. Jesus has an important person's child to go heal. But Jesus does something really interesting. Jesus stops. Even though he didn't have to, Jesus stops. And he says, who touched me? And even though even his disciples were like, that's the dumbest question ever. Like, thousands of people are trying to touch you. Why would you even ask that question? And as a social psychologist, as someone with this hermeneutic of trying to understand how does Jesus indicate that he's aware of the social situation, how does Jesus empty himself of his power and his privileges, that question, why did Jesus ask who touched me, is fascinating, because what happens next is then the woman got to tell her story. And I love the way Mark says it. She told her truth, her whole truth. So here we have a woman of color, a Middle Eastern woman, who'd been sick, horribly sick for 12 years. She's like the custodians at the Divinity school. I've seen a lot of things. When you're on the underbelly of society, you see a lot of things about how society works, who's phony and who's real, who's loving and who's stingy, who walks the walk and who just talks the talk, who's righteous and who's unjust. You get to see a lot about what the society actually values, regardless of what it says it values. You get to see God move in special ways, God perform miracles in special ways. And so she gets to tell her whole truth. I bet it was not a short truth. She had been sick for 12 years. I bet it was not a linear truth either. I bet it wasn't like a TED Talk. It wasn't dazzling in the way that privileged people often expect to be dazzled when they stop to listen to someone. It maybe wasn't coherent in a way that privileged people expect people to be coherent. It maybe wasn't told from a perspective that centers the privileged people. But but she got to tell her whole truth. She probably looked really terrible. She probably looked very sick, probably had a decaying body. She probably smelled pretty terribly. What she was saying was probably circular and jumbled, and yet she got to tell her whole truth. And in that moment, Jesus reversed the power dynamics of that space. This woman went from being a marginalized woman in society who no one even noticed other than to maybe curse her, to becoming the preacher who got to tell her truth about what is going on in this world. She went from being the most marginalized person in society to being the center of what God was doing. All eyes were on Jesus and Jairus, the two people with the most power and privilege, the people who always have the mic in society. And by asking, "Who touched me?" Jesus put Jairus on hold, and he also gave up his own mic to give to this woman so she could tell her whole truth. And the community was transformed. Now, if you think about it, this was at risk to Jesus because Jairus has power. Jairus could use his power and authority and privilege to punish Jesus for not snapping to it when he needed him. And isn't that what a lot of people with privilege and power expect? I want it on my terms. If I'm going to come ask for help, you better help me on my terms. And this whole time, Jesus is performing this miracle, right? Obviously, the woman is healed, but her identity is being healed, right? That's even bigger than her body. And this community is being healed because a woman who's been marginalized is being brought to the center and is able to tell her truth in a way that is life-giving to everybody in this community. And meanwhile, Jairus is just standing there. Jairus is just standing there holding his pain. And I've scoured Josephus, all the historians at that time, everyone who has any perspective on this scenario, and there's no evidence anywhere that Jairus stepped in and said, "Okay, Jesus, I'm really glad you healed her, but now come on, we need to keep it moving." Because this whole truth is getting kind of lengthy. Also, she doesn't really make a lot of sense. She's a little bit, And that would have been within his rights. People who have power and privilege get to set the agenda. They get to say when it's time to move on. And to be fair, Jairus had his own need. While this woman was telling her whole truth, Jairus was still sitting there with this possibility that his child would die. He had his own pain. But Jairus doesn't step in. As far as we know, he just bears witness to this gospel telling of this woman, to this community transformation. He just bears witness. I try to imagine what Jairus was thinking in that moment. One of my research assistants and I have been doing a big project for the last year where we've been interviewing religious and community leaders who claim to care about privilege and power. And we've been trying to understand under what circumstances do they actually act on those values of values for justice, and when do they act in self-preservational ways, even though they might say, "Oh yeah, I definitely, I believe that more women should be bishops, but." So one of the things we found is there's like a central fear that a lot of people in privilege and power have, and it's, yes, I'm for justice, but if justice happens, if the world becomes more equal, what's going to happen to me? That's the fear. It's a resource scarcity mentality. It's the theology of scarcity, right? I want more female faculty members to get promoted, but if that happens, will I, a male, get promoted? Or I want there to be more institutional practices to attract and retain and fund the educations of dreamers at the school. But what's going to happen when my kid applies? Will there be room for my kid? I want to give generously to efforts that address inequality, but if I give too much, will I have enough for me? That's the fear that we hear over and over and over again as we're interviewing these leaders. And it goes to show that most of us don't actually believe in the resurrection. We talk about it, but when it comes to it, we're not a lot like Jairus. So Jairus is probably sitting there holding on to this pain, this fear. If Jesus stays here and does what he's doing, which, yay, I'm maybe glad it's happening, what's going to happen to me? And then Jairus' worst fear is realized. The word comes from his servants. Your child's dead now. Don't even bother the teacher. It's done. And this is like every privileged person's worst fear coming to life. See, I knew that God wasn't abundant enough. I knew that there couldn't be enough for everyone. There's not enough love for everyone. Power really is a scarce resource. The resurrection isn't true. If I don't get what I need, what I think I need right now, if I don't hold on to what I have, then there won't be enough. And what's so neat to me is that even though Jairus gets the word back that his child has died, Jesus looks at him and says, just believe. And when I apply my perichoresis framework to this passage, I have to understand that Jairus was somehow able to believe because he had been present and practicing the perichoresis that Jesus was inviting him into. Because Jairus stood there and received this woman's truth, he was able to continue to believe even when all hope was lost. He had just heard this woman preach to him. And he received that. It transformed him, and he was able to believe. And then Jesus went and resurrected his daughter. And it turns out that there's enough of power, there's enough abundance, there's enough for all of us to have our needs met. But I really wonder if Jairus would have gotten what he needed if this woman hadn't gotten what she needed. Because we're interdependent. We're made in the image of a perichoretic God. And unless all of us are healed, none of us are healed. Unless all of us are affirmed, none of us are affirmed. And so when we think about Jesus and we think about kenosis, we have to ask ourselves this question, and I'm going to end soon so we have time for Q&A, but we have to ask ourselves this question. If I want to empty myself, like Jesus did, I have to take inventory of what it is that I need to empty. Because I can't just be humble vaguely. Vague humility is not going to help any of us. Jesus was strategic. Jesus knew exactly where he had power and privilege and voice and relative to other people, and he knew how to ask the question, like, who touched me, to shift the entire power dynamic. And we can do that ourselves, but we have to take inventory. What are the ways in our society in which we have privilege and voice and power? And I'm going to invite you into this conversation by just telling a really short story about my own life, because I'm here on this stage. I just finished my second book. I just sent my third book proposal to my agent last week. I will probably get a great book contract. People want to know what I think. People invite me to be on to interview for their TV shows and their documentaries. I'm a professor at Duke. I got all this stuff going for me. People want to know, what does Christena Cleveland think? Can we have her come, influence us, be on the stage, have a voice? Meanwhile, my neighbors in North Minneapolis, where I still have a condo and I lived for years and years and years, and I'm still close with these folks, they have astute observations about the world that are way beyond what I have to say, and nobody's giving them book contracts. Nobody's inviting them to come speak. Nobody's asking them to write articles. I remember a few years ago when that show Blackish first came out, Christianity Today magazine asked me to write an article about it. And so I actually just I ordered a pizza and got like 10 of my neighbors to come over and we watched the first 4 episodes together. Because I was just like, I don't know what you all think about this show. You guys have interesting things to say all the time. You're like the woman who preached after being sick for 12 years. You've seen a couple things, but nobody wants them. I have privilege and power in our society. And when I talk to my students, not really my Duke students, because they're a little bit further along, but when I would talk to my Bethel students about this, they would be like, Dr. Cleveland, you're being way too hard on yourself. Like, you deserve it. Every bit of privilege and power that you have, you deserve to have a voice. You worked hard for it. And they get like super defensive on my behalf. Really, they're getting defensive about themselves, but it looks like advocacy. And I'm like, yeah, I did work hard. It's true, I was there. Yeah. I was there for the all-nighters. I wrote my dissertation. It's true. But I was also born into a family where the wind was blowing behind me. And every step of the way, I had support from my family and my community. And my parents pretty much only cared about 2 things when we were growing up, Jesus and education. And my dad and his brother grew up in Compton, California, and my dad went to Yale and his brother went to Princeton, and even though they figured out a way to hang in those spaces, they realized that a lot of their classmates were much better prepared for college than they were having gone to public school in Compton. And so they decided to raise their kids, all 6 of us combined. There's 3 kids in my family and 3 in my uncle's family. They decided to raise us so that we could go to Ivy League schools. And so I started studying for the SATs when I was in 1st grade. And I would come home from school. I was already in the accelerated classes because my mom's degree is in gifted education. And so when we were like preschoolers, she just taught us like we were gifted. I don't know if we were, but she didn't know anything else other than to teach gifted education. And so then we ended up just sort of testing into these programs, so I actually had to stay an extra hour after school, and then I would come home and I'd do my homework, and then I would have 90 minutes of SAT prep work that my dad assigned me as a 1st grader. And I didn't know at the time that I was studying for the SATs. I just thought it was workbooks that I was doing. But then when I took the SATs like 10 years later, I was like, oh, this is remarkably familiar. I'm really good at this. And so it was SAT prep, and I did that all throughout it. My parents, they wanted us to be cultured so that when we got into these Ivy League spaces, we would feel comfortable. So we had season tickets to the San Francisco Opera, Ballet, and Symphony. And we would go as a family, and we would get all dressed up, and we would learn how to hobnob with people and be comfortable in places like Davies Hall and Zellerbach at UC Berkeley, etc. And they also did something that if I ever have kids, I'll probably do too. They lied to us. They told us that the only thing open in the summer was the library. And we were like super sheltered, so we had no idea, right? And so it's like, oh, school's closed. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. Everything's closed except for the library. And so we would get up and we would take our lunches and we would spend the whole day in the library. We didn't get to play outside on the street until after dinner. We spent all day doing enrichment activities at the library. And when I was in 3rd grade, my dad signed us up for UC Berkeley Saturday Science Academy. And it was all kids of color who were in this program, and we were taught by UC Berkeley undergrads of color. So I learned as a 3rd grader how to take BART into Berkeley, walk up Telegraph Avenue, walk onto the campus, get comfortable on a major research university campus, navigate my way to the science building, and I would spend all day being taught by people who looked like me in a lab at Berkeley. And I was like, how hard can college be? Like, I'm already doing it, basically, as a 3rd grader. I was super comfortable already. And at home, it was kind of like college, too, because my dad went to Yale, so we had Yale everything, Yale toothbrushes, Yale blankets, Yale towels. You know, when I joined the basketball team, my dad got me Yale women's basketball sweats. Yale, 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 everything. And then every night at dinner, we had to recite the 8 Ivy League schools to my dad so that he knew that we knew where we were going. And when I struggled in my honors geometry class as a 9th grader, my parents got me a tutor. And when I got bored at public school in the honors classes, my parents helped me apply to boarding school and helped me navigate the financial aid process so that we could afford it. And every step of the way, when I struggled, I got support. When I worked hard, I saw results. And so when I got into Dartmouth, it was like I fell in. And if you look at the Clevelands, all 6 of us, between the 6 of us, we have degrees from Yale, Dartmouth, Harvard, MIT, Princeton, and Oberlin. Yes, those are the 6 schools that we all went to. If you have the support, if you have the resources, you can do anything. The thing is when I was living in North Minneapolis, I got to know a bunch of girls who had all the resilience that I have, all the smarts that I have, all the hope that I have, all the determination that I have. But every step of the way, they put effort in and they're just met with impediments. Whether it's in their community, it's in their homes, it's in their schools. I started this thing called Breakfast Club where I got to know one of my neighbors and all of her kids. She's my age and she has a bunch of kids, and her oldest was a 9th grader at the time, and she started coming over to my house for breakfast just to hang out, and she's like, oh, like, you seem like you kind of know how to navigate this world of school and everything. Can you help me just think about my classes? And I was like, sure, and why don't you come over for breakfast on Saturday? And that's how I got started. First day, she showed up with 3 of her friends. Within 2 weeks, about 20 girls were coming over on Saturday for breakfast, and we were just talking about what's this possibility. I was the first person they'd ever met who looked like them, who'd gone to college. So they were like, this is a possibility. And so we started talking about, gosh, what might this look like? And Breakfast Club turned into kind of breakfast and lunch club because we were starting to do SAT prep and strategizing about how are you going to pass this class and how do you respond to this teacher who's punitive? You know, how do you not get like arrested at school? I mean, these were like the things that they were dealing with. And then they started bringing their laundry over because I had a washer and a dryer. And so it just turned into a whole day, and it was just this holistic body, mind, and soul, right? How do we address everything? I put on a pot of soup. We would just keep working. And one of the things I learned was that even if against all odds, because really only 40% of students at the school in my neighborhood, the school that my taxes pay for, 40% of the school students graduate. I mean, there's just no reason to graduate. There's nothing there for them. The school actually looks like a prison. If against all odds you somehow graduate, the school curriculum does not offer the courses that are needed in order to apply to a school like Fresno Pacific. It is not a college prep curriculum. They go to public school, and if they successfully graduate, they still cannot apply to college because their school does not offer the courses that you need in order to apply to college. So it's not, I'm not on the stage just because I worked hard. Because those girls work hard. They were willing to get up at 8 o'clock on a Saturday morning and come hang out with me. And it wasn't my cooking, I'm telling you that. Sometimes people talk about privilege as the wind blowing behind your back. When the wind is blowing behind your back, you almost don't even notice it. It just feels like a good day. But oppression is when the wind is blowing against you, and walking that extra mile takes the life out of you. When I was talking with some of my Bethel students about this, one of my students was, because we were talking about what are the different forms of privilege, and I just named mine. Educational, formal education is a privilege in the United States. Only about 32% of adults in the United States have a college degree, and less than 1% of adults in the world have a college degree. Once you have a college degree, the door just is wide open for you. You're much more likely to, even if you grew up in poverty, no longer be in poverty. You're much more likely to get paid more. You're much more likely to have a voice. Politicians care about your vote. Politicians are actually talking to you. That's one of the reasons why President Trump was such a catalytic candidate, is for the first time he was talking to an entire group of people who are never talked to by politics. And I was watching the Democratic National Convention, and I had been reading a book about class privilege, and I was just like, oh my gosh, none of the people speaking are talking to anyone who's not middle class. Why would I vote for you if I live in Appalachia and you just erased my entire existence? And just noticing politicians want my vote. That's power right there. And so we were talking about the class privilege that I have from formal education. But of course, we were talking about white privilege, and we were talking about male privilege, and we were talking about heterosexual privilege, and we were talking about Christian privilege, and all the ways in which we have a voice and influence in society. And one of my students said, "Are you saying that just because I'm a white person, I'm inherently at fault?" And I said, "I'm really glad you asked that question. Because no, I am not saying that. I'm saying you've inherited a fault. I'm not inherently at fault because I was born into my family, but I have inherited a fault. I went to Dartmouth. The reason why a Dartmouth degree is worth so much is because other degrees aren't worth much. And because not having a degree is a deficit. It's all relational. I can't be prestigious without someone else being derogated. I can't have more of a voice or a platform without someone else being silenced. Inequality is relational. Does that mean that I need to turn inward and go into shame and crawl under a hole and think that someone's attacking me? No, that never helped anybody. And it's also not from God or me. But it does mean that I need to take responsibility and say, if I really want to practice the perichoresis that Paul's inviting us into, if I really want to address issues of inequality, it starts with me recognizing what I need to empty myself of. Are there places on this campus where students of color, undocumented students, LGBTQ students, differently able students feel marginalized and don't have a voice? What might it be for someone like me who has a voice, who is considered normal, to empty myself of privilege to create space for other people to have a voice? And what might that cost me? Because Jesus emptied himself and emptied himself and emptied himself and emptied himself, and eventually emptied himself so much that he ended up on the cross. That's the pathway to resurrection for us. Paul connects the cross and the resurrection to our unity. We're really running out of time, and I do want to make sure there's enough time for at least a few questions or, grievances or something. So let me stop here, because I've been talking for a long time, and it's toasty in here. Oh, usually white people turn up the air conditioning really high. Questions? Comments? We have a question over here. Thanks.
Is it over here or come here?
Hi. So my husband and I just had a son, and we know that he's going to likely face very real racial issues. And we know that raising him Christian with a reverence for biblical principles is the very best that we can do for his upbringing. But are there any intentional, maybe social practices to implement to help him to address very real issues that he's going to face?
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank
first
you.
Of all. Also, way to go, because motherhood is revolutionary. So, motherhood is revolutionary.
Oh, yes, it is. Oh, my goodness, yes.
And I think it's
love
really
it.
brave to intentionally have a black boy in our society.
Yeah.
So, congratulations.
Okay.
I think one of the most powerful things you can do is to immerse him in a community that can affirm the image of God in him.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Immerse him in a community that can affirm the image of God in him.
Okay.
He's going to get assaulted by society, but if he can go to not just your home, but a broader community, a church community, a neighborhood, a space where people see the image of God in him first and foremost, that's going to be huge.
Okay, amen. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think there was a question here too.
Thank you so much. I especially appreciated your discussion on the perichoresis. And at one point, I think you mentioned the Jairus kind of invited to participate in the perichoresis. Every time I hear the word participate or participation, I think of the Michael Gorman of the biblical scholar, who actually reads the Philippians 2:6. Instead of saying though he was God, he suggested us to read the because he was God. So if it's like even though he was God, he did this, sounds like it's so hard to do. It's against the nature of God.
Totally.
But if we read because he was God, it's very much in accordance with divine nature.
Yes.
So in a sense that it's not that we have to make an effort to empty ourselves. It's about us participating in God's lead or perichoresis, that God will help us.
Yeah, we're
empty
at our
ourselves.
most human and our most in the image of God when we do that.
So question is what's your take on the alternative reading?
Oh, I think that's beautiful. Thank you. Yeah. And just to sum up what he said, in case everyone didn't hear it, is he was saying that one interpretation of in verse is that 6, though he was God, it's because he was God. So it's not that Jesus was going against his nature as God, but it's really because he was God that he even practiced kenosis. And it's because we're humans made in the image of God that we get to participate the way that Jairus was, which I think is lovely. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My question has more to do with, as you were growing up, did you ever feel a disconnect or an inner conflict between the privilege you saw that you held and, everyone else around you? Did you ever feel kind of anything at all about that?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking that. Yes, absolutely. I noticed inequality everywhere. That's just that's sort of how I see the world. And I remember asking a lot of questions when I was a kid. Just like, at Christmas we would go into San Francisco and pass out food to homeless people or something. And the theology that I would get in response was really a theology of merit, like a meritocratic theology, where it's the reason why they're homeless is because they're not really doing what they need to do. And so then, as a child, I sort of developed a theology that's a very individualistic meritocracy theology that many evangelical Christians have, still hold on to, right? Where it's if you didn't go to college, it's because you're lazy, or if you're poor, it's because you're lazy, you're stupid, and you're not willing to work hard. And so that was how I managed that tension until I got older and was able to read and see things beyond that. And I think my story is pretty typical, Sure, great.
Hello. First of all, I'm looking for friends of color, so shout out for that. And because I am feeling the fire of the black sheep, and my husband is Ugandan, and I was a missionary, then I got rejected by the missionary community because of my relationship with my husband. We moved here to Fresno less than a year ago, had our daughter. So in all of that, feeling the fire of the black sheep. So maybe you could speak on that, but also I'm really interested in your YWAM experience as a person of color and with missions and colonialism and white saviors and all of that.
Yes. I'm going to address your first comment first, looking for friends of color. Great impulse. My recommendation is to start volunteering for a nonprofit that's led by people of color. And then you can just work alongside folks in an organic way on their terms, get to know them. Because I'm really busy just being black. So I don't really have time for more friends. But if you want to just join the efforts that I'm already doing, you're welcome. So that's one strategy. I think evangelical missions have a long lineage of being colonialistic. I've done a lot of work around mindful self-compassion, and so I look on my time as an 18-year-old at YWAM with a lot of self-compassion and like, oh, little Christina, you were doing the best you could with the information you had at the time. And God is big enough to cover a multitude of sins. And it wasn't all terrible, even though I probably wouldn't invest that sort of time and effort in something like that now. And it's also not to say that there isn't a way to do missions that is post-colonial. So I don't want to say, paint broad strokes with, paint the entire organization with broad strokes. I will say, I've heard, I spoke at Urbana. I think they're doing another one, right? This year, is this the year for Urbana? Okay, yeah, they did not invite me back. But anyways, it's fine, trust me. But I spoke at it last time, and so I kind of got reconnected with the missions community in a way that I hadn't. And I actually learned that YWAM is having a hard time recruiting millennials because millennials don't want to go one place for 6 months. So the concept of short-term missions is not even shorter. Scary. So now there's this new thing called world missions, world race, where it's like YWAM, but you go to 12 countries in 12 months, and the tagline is Adventures in Missions. So it's even more consumerist. Yeah, so it just shows like, gosh, we're shaping a really individual, consumeristic, evangelical soul. So, because it's like people don't want to commit to 6 months in one place, which I already thought was like sketchy, that I was there for 6 months telling them what they should about God. So, yay for post-colonialism. Yeah.
I think we have time maybe for one last question.
Hi. When you first caught yourself categorizing, how did you react and how did you combat it?
Ooh, great question. So I'm really, I'm literally the queen of categorization. Like I wrote that book because I needed it. And it's funny because in my small group Bible study, everyone was gracious enough to read the book when it came out. And so then we started as a community sort of like dinging people when they would categorize, because now we had all the tools and it was all in our conscious awareness, and this was like a way to hold ourselves accountable, even in small group and stuff. And we were all single and friends, so we like lived so much of our life together. So it wasn't just small group we would do this, but I got to a point where I was getting dinged so often that they were like, it's a good thing you wrote that book, you need it more than everybody in the group. Yeah. But, I think what helps is to have other people around me who also are aware. And so then they can point out, okay, are you sure? Like, you just made a statement like they all. Or it seems like this is playing a huge role in your identity, and you're resisting information that might be helpful to you. So I think reading, it doesn't have to be my book. There's so many good books about this. I'd say Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, is really good too. And so like you just getting a chance to create a community where we have a shared language and a shared awareness, and we're giving each other permission to speak up and say, you know what, I know you're used to saying things like that, but that's actually not helpful. And to be receptive. Can we do one more question? Okay, thanks. Sure, how about you? That would be great. No pressure. Last question.
Hello, thank you for coming here. As someone who's somewhat lost his faith around early adolescence, how would you say is a good way to introduce myself to the Word of God and to find a good ministry that'll be accepting of my parents who are within the LGBT community? And actually, they just got married a month ago, so.
Congratulations. Congratulations. Your parents just got married, or you just got married?
They just got married.
Your parents just got married?
No, I'm a little too young.
Okay, yeah. I'm sorry that you experienced rejection and that disconnect, because I don't think that's consistent with what Jesus taught. And I think it's really brave that you're in a space like this. I think my recommendation is to connect with people who can affirm your commitment and your interest in Scripture, and also your commitment to your parents. And I think that can be really difficult to do. But I imagine there are spaces here is there anyone who knows of spaces like that in Fresno? Are you in the Fresno area? Are you from here? Are there any people what's your name? What's your name? Francisco can connect with, who might just be able to give him some ideas. I see a hand here. Anyone else who's willing to connect? Okay, there's a hand over there. Can you connect with Francisco after this? Because I would just love for you to get introduced to possible communities that can help you navigate some really just challenging questions and interpretations of Scripture, and also just be your friend. And celebrate you and celebrate your family. Yeah. Thank you, God. Well, thank you.